Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Has it really been 8 years, she thought to herself, recalling the bright sunshine, the smell of roasted corn, and the cheerful crowds at the city fair organized by the local authorities to celebrate the town's anniversary. Back then, Jane had no idea that among the bustling crowd, a fateful encounter was waiting for her. It all started so easily, Jane sighed sadly. She remembered the feeling of embarrassment, her cheeks blushing, as she listened to Victor sing a love ballad with his guitar. At that moment, she was standing next to a stall selling handmade toys, captivated by his unusual brown eyes that seemed to see right through her soul. Then they both rode the merry-go-round, she small and playful, and he, like a giant stepping out of a fairy tale. "What's your name, beautiful girl?" Victor had asked when the ride stopped, and Jane was about to leave without a reply. "Jane," she whispered, looking down. "Jane, what a beautiful name." "I'm Victor," he responded, and for the first time, Jane saw true joy in his eyes. They spent the rest of the evening strolling, joking, and chatting about everything and nothing. Jane felt like she was living in a fairy tale, drawn in by Victor's stories about his dreams of teaching music to children, his love for his work, and his wish to have a big, warm family. Then, their first kiss under the bright lights marked the beginning of their future happiness. However, Jane had never thought that the world could change so unpredictably, that love could fade like a spark from an unlit torch. When it was time for the divorce hearing, the nurse had lost everything. Her husband and his lover smirked, but they had no idea that a surprise was waiting for them in the principal's office. Dim light filled the room, with just a narrow beam of light streaming through a crack in the curtains, creating strange patterns on the wall. Jane, the school nurse, stood across from the desk, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over her. She still couldn't believe she was about to be in a courtroom, ready to dissolve 8 years of her life. "So, you're asking for some time off, Jane?" Patricia, the school principal, asked quite bluntly. The older woman, with her hair dyed a deep aubergine and a slightly sad smile, looked at Jane. Jane nodded, feeling her throat tighten and her eyes well up. Of course," Patricia replied with a confident smile, fiddling with the large ring on her hand. "Personal life always comes first." Deep down, Jane wished that were truly the case, but personal life turned out not to be easy and smooth. On the contrary, it was now filled with sharp edges, resentment, and pain. I need to be at court by 11 o'clock, Jane murmured. "It's a divorce, you understand." Patricia frowned slightly but quickly smiled again. "Oh, Jane," she sighed. "I've always said you're a strong woman. Your little boy, Paul, he's been in school here for 2 years, right? I've been married 3 times and still haven't found happiness." Jane forced a bitter smile. Strong. She just hoped she wouldn't break down in tears from the bitterness and hurt. "So, can I take the day off?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course, what are you even talking about?" Patricia answered, once more fiddling with her ring. "But you understand that we have a lot of work to do right now." She continued to talk about another inspection and the need to prepare a report for the health board, but Jane wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was drifting away to the courtroom, where these proceedings would be the final end to her marriage with Victor. She nodded absently, mumbling, Yes, trying to hide her fatigue and emptiness. "Do you understand? We have so much work to do right now," Patricia finished, looking at Jane with a reproachful gaze. Unable to take it any longer, Jane sighed and finally made up her mind. "Sorry, Patricia, but I want to leave now. Is that okay?" Jane said all at once. "Well then," Patricia muttered, glancing at her watch. "Go ahead. But make sure you finish that report." Jane wanted to respond, but the principal had already lowered her head, burying herself in paperwork. The nurse left the office, breathing a sigh of relief. She could finally head to the courthouse, where she would officially be free. Jane stepped out of the office, walked down the stairs, crossed the schoolyard, and headed toward the bus stop. Time was running short, but she felt confident she would make it. Oh, if only it hadn't been for the principal with her complaints and lectures. The janitor Daniel waved cheerfully, and Jane waved back, lifting his broom as if it were an old-fashioned rifle. The outside air was sweltering, stifling. As Jane neared the bus stop, she heard a commotion and saw a man suddenly stagger and collapse onto the asphalt. She jumped, her heart pounding. She quickly looked around. A group of students nearby was happily chatting and taking selfies, not noticing the stranger. Jane approached the fallen man, bent down, and tried to rouse him. He was dressed in dirty clothes and smelled of the street. Jane guessed he was probably homeless. The nurse carefully placed her hand on his forehead, feeling it was very hot. "Can you hear me? Are you feeling unwell? Please say something," but he did not respond. It was then that Jane realized the homeless man was breathing very hard and might need emergency medical attention. She glanced around and tried once more to revive him, but he remained unconscious. Jane took out a handkerchief to wipe the man's forehead, then pulled out her phone and dialed for emergency services. "Hello, I'm at the elementary school, and there's a man here lying unconscious. Please send a medical team." "Wait a moment, we'll be there in 5 to 7 minutes, the operator responded. "All right, we'll wait," Jane replied and hung up. She turned back to the stranger and placed her hand on his forehead again, feeling it was even hotter than before. At that moment, Jane realized the homeless man was in critical condition. Suddenly, he stopped breathing. Jane froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She remembered the first aid course she had taken during her nurse training. The technique for chest compressions flashed in her mind. Knowing there was no time to waste, she quickly lifted the man's shoulders and laid him flat on his back. "All right, stay calm, Jane, you can do this," she whispered to herself, taking a deep breath. Quickly finding the right spot below the man's sternum, Jane began pressing hard. 1, 2, 3, 4, she counted with each motion, hoping for a miracle. By that time, a group of students had gathered, perhaps hearing the commotion and finally noticing her. "Please step back," Jane shouted as she continued the chest compressions. The students stepped back, eyes wide with curiosity and fear. One of the teenagers pulled out a phone and started recording. 1, 2, 3, 4, please, come on, please, Jane muttered like a chant. It felt like she had been doing it forever, but finally, the homeless man's eyelids twitched, and then he took a hesitant breath. Tears welled up in Jane's eyes. "He's alive, oh my God, he's alive," the nurse whispered, feeling an immense sense of relief. Just then, an ambulance appeared from around the corner. "Hey, over here. I called you," Jane shouted, waving. The paramedics quickly exited the vehicle, approached the homeless man, and began assessing his condition. Jane stepped back and sighed with relief. She had done everything she could, and more. She had saved a life, even though she had never done anything like it before. "And I thought the divorce was going to be the biggest event of my life," Jane whispered, watching as the medics lifted the man onto a stretcher. Her heart was still pounding when she finally arrived at the courthouse. She was late, too late. Her watch read 11:17, and the divorce hearing with Victor had been scheduled to start at 11 sharp. She stared at a message from her lawyer that read, "Jane, don't be late," trying to catch her breath. Jane climbed to the second floor and looked at the first door, wondering, "Can I do this?" The door was marked Courtroom 2. She took a deep breath and pushed it open. As soon as she stepped into the spacious room, she saw a large table in the center, with the judge, dressed in a black robe, sitting behind it, the court clerk to the right and Victor's lawyer to the left. The courtroom was unusually crowded with reporters, photographers, lawyers, and curious onlookers. It made sense, you don't see the divorce of a wealthy businessman every day. Jane looked at the empty seat opposite Victor's lawyer. There were 2 chairs, and it was clear that one was meant for her. Jane glanced at Victor. His face was pale and tense, and he looked at her with a defiant, contemptuous stare. Beside him was Sylvia, in a bright red dress with a deep neckline, her face glowing with unrestrained glee. Jane quickly sat down, and her lawyer Ricardo hastily stood up and introduced her to the judge. "Your Honor, may I introduce Jane, the plaintiff in this case?" The judge frowned and then announced that the hearing would proceed. "We were just discussing the plaintiff's material requests of the defendant," the judge said. Jane looked at Victor's lawyer, who smirked and asked, "Jane, have you changed your mind? Do you still want to divorce Victor?" "Your Honor, I am determined to divorce," Jane responded. "Since you missed the opening statements, we'll move on to discussing the material claims," the judge said. Jane and her lawyer had discussed the details of asset division with Victor's lawyer. Throughout the discussion, Jane tried to remain calm and not show her anger. She could feel Victor's gaze on her, full of hatred and smugness, but she refused to let the betrayer rob her of her composure. Jane struggled to maintain her poise and show the judge that she was not afraid of her husband and would not bow down to his pressure. "I request the division of all assets we acquired during our marriage," Jane said, repeating the statement her lawyer had prepared. "Your Honor, I request that the court dismiss the plaintiff's demands. Jane has no right to claim the assets my client purchased after she left the house," Victor's lawyer said without blinking. Jane flushed with anger and pain. "Your Honor, that is an outright lie. I had to leave about a month ago because my husband was repeatedly unfaithful and then brought another woman into our home." The judge looked at Victor and asked, "Victor, do you agree with the plaintiff's statements? Did you actually do this?" Victor stood up, looking at his wife with disdain. "Your Honor, I never betrayed my wife before she chose to leave me. She got tired of my love and care. What she's doing now is just an attempt to get back at me for finding happiness with someone else, someone far more beautiful and successful than her. I urge you not to believe this liar who is trying to deceive you to take everything we built together during our marriage." Jane could no longer hold back, she spoke out. "After everything, the initial capital Victor had came from my late father after he sold the family farm." "Jane, please calm down," the judge said. "I also ask that you provide evidence to support your claims. Otherwise, everything you are saying here is baseless. Furthermore, the 2 of you have a child together. Where is Paul right now?" "At school," Jane whispered hesitantly. "At school? He should be here because the child's opinion will be considered in deciding custody," the judge emphasized in a stern tone. Jane's heart sank, tears blurring her vision, but she tried to compose herself, maintaining some semblance of calm. The judge firmly declared, "We will now proceed to the matter of the child's residence." Jane could not believe that her son Paul, her 8-year-old angel, would become a pawn in this divorce battle with Victor. She felt she was willing to trade anything to be with her son, but fate seemed to be mocking her, turning everything into an unimaginable knot. The tension in the courtroom grew thick, with only the sound of the judge's gavel breaking the silence. Jane looked at Victor, the man she had once loved with all her heart, now just a stranger before her. His eyes burned with rage, while his lips curled into a mocking smile. "Your Honor," Victor's lawyer began, emphasizing each word. "I must state that my client believes the child's residence should be with his father." Jane jumped up, her heart pounding in terror. "No, no. Paul can't stay with Victor, he can't take care of him. He never cared for him," she shouted. The judge nodded indifferently. "Jane, please control your emotions. We're handling this case in court, not at a market." Ricardo, her lawyer, looked at his client with sympathy, then addressed the court. "Your Honor, I am prepared to provide evidence that my client, Jane, is a deserving mother who has always cared for her son and can raise him in the best possible way." A tense argument followed. Victor's lawyer argued that Jane had abandoned her family and failed to provide adequately for Paul, making her an unsuitable parent. Jane tried to prove that it was Victor who had abandoned his wife and child, and her departure was a necessary measure. The judge, like an impartial observer, carefully reviewed the documents presented, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Jane tried to emphasize that even though Victor had a stable income, he didn't give enough attention to their son. On the contrary, Victor claimed that Jane worked in a low-paying job and could not provide their son with a good childhood. The judge listened in silence, reserving the right to have the final word. When he finally spoke, everyone present held their breath. "We have held this hearing and listened to all parties involved. Based on the documents and testimonies provided, we have reached the following decision: the marriage between Victor and Jane is hereby dissolved. The child, Paul, will remain with his father. Victor's assets are not subject to division due to a lack of evidence proving they were acquired during the marriage." Jane stood still like a frozen statue, the judge's words echoing in her ears like a recording on an old gramophone. "Wonderful," Victor said, unable to hide his smile. "Sylvia and I are very pleased, well done." But for Jane, everything around her blurred into a dark haze. She struggled to breathe as a lump rose in her throat. She looked up at her ex-husband, who was looking at her with a triumphant smile. His eyes now glowed with malice, and his lips stretched into a sneer. How could he do this? The thought flashed through her mind, knowing that he fully understood Paul needed a mother's love and care. Jane stood up and left the courtroom, ignoring the sympathetic glances of those around her. She just wanted to run, to escape to somewhere far away, where she wouldn't be haunted by the memories of today. She stepped outside, and the hot September wind swept across her face. This autumn was unusual, hot and dry. Tears flowed down like a river, but Jane kept walking down the street, oblivious to the judgmental stares of passers-by. Thank you for watching the video all the way through. You are our biggest motivation to keep creating. Let us know where you're watching from so we can see how far this video has reached around the world. Don't forget to hit like if you found it interesting, and share it with your friends too. The only thought in her mind was how to go on without her son. Her world had shrunk to nothing but the bitter emptiness in her heart, the unbearable pain of losing the most precious thing in her life, her little boy. Even the sun seemed to be crying with her. Jane wandered across the school grounds where life continued, with children running, laughing, and rushing to their classes, while teachers planned for the upcoming day. Only Jane felt like a stranger in this world. Her eyes skimmed over the faces of the kids she had long been familiar with. She remembered the day Paul had clung tightly to her hand on his first day of school, nervous about the long separation. Back then, she didn't work at this school and had just moved to be closer to her son 8 months earlier. "Mom, I'll miss you," the little boy had whispered, looking into her eyes. "And I'll miss you too," Jane had replied, holding her son tightly in her arms. And now, Paul would be living with Victor in his clean but cold house. Jane couldn't accept it. She wanted to scream from the pain but tried to hold back her tears so as not to show her helplessness in front of the children and teachers. "Jane, what's wrong?" Daniel, always caring and kind, asked. The janitor had noticed Jane standing a few dozen meters from the school, her head bowed. "Nothing," she replied, trying to muster a smile. "Just a little tired." But Daniel had seen everything, the traces of tears on her cheeks, the trembling lips. He approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry," he said softly. "Everything will be all right." "How can everything be all right?" Jane whispered, unable to hold back her tears any longer. "I've lost my son. Paul will now live with Victor." The janitor shook his head and held her hand, implying he would not let her face this alone. "Paul is your son, your flesh and blood. He feels everything, and he'll know you're always there for him." "But how?" Jane looked at the janitor with desperate eyes. "How can I be there for him when he's no longer living with me?" "Everything will be okay," Daniel repeated, looking at her with deep sympathy. Jane tried to hold back her tears as she walked into the school, her hands still trembling, and her mind filled only with thoughts of her son. She had always seen herself as a nurse, someone who helped others, but now she wondered how to help herself get through this emotional pain. The door to the nurse's office opened, and Elena, a young teacher, stepped in. The teacher, with her beautiful dark hair always styled carefully, and her blue eyes that always seemed to hold a mystery. "Jane," Elena said, peeking into the nurse's office. "I heard about your case." "Yes," Jane replied, trying to smile through her despair. "Everything has been decided." "I'm so sorry," Elena said as she approached her. "I know how difficult this must be for you right now." "Thank you," Jane whispered, feeling the lump rise again in her throat. "Paul is a very smart and kind boy," Elena continued, her eyes full of sincere empathy. "I believe he will understand what's happening and will stand by you." Jane sighed, feeling sad. Everything felt too hard for her, but she still wanted to believe in Elena's words, hoping that her love for her son would overcome all obstacles. Thank you, Elena," Jane whispered, feeling a flicker of hope in her heart. "It's nothing, really. I didn't do anything special," Elena replied with an encouraging smile. Jane saw her out of the room and then turned back to her work. She absent-mindedly glanced around her small but cozy office. On the desk was a framed photo of Paul on his first day of school, her son smiling, his eyes sparkling with happiness. Jane placed her hand on the picture, as if trying to pour all her love into it. "I will never leave you, my love," she thought of Paul. "I will always be with you, no matter what." At that moment, she was ready to fight for her son and the love she had for him. But her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," she answered without looking up. Patricia, the school principal, walked in with her usual stern face and a judgmental gaze. "Jane," she began with a stiff and formal tone, the discomfort evident in her voice. "I need to have a word with you." "Yes, Patricia," Jane replied, still not looking up. "A young man stopped by when you were away," the principal continued. He introduced himself as Michael. "A well-dressed man, driving an SUV and accompanied by a bodyguard. He was asking about you and your personal life. You know, a school is not a place for personal affairs. You have a work schedule, and there are children who need care. If you're lacking focus, find a hobby or read a book, but the way you're behaving now." Patricia paused, looking at Jane with a disapproving look. "It's very unprofessional. You know, it's not just staff but parents who come to the school, and trust me, they see everything. There will be rumors that the school nurse is involved with some businessmen. I don't want to hear those kinds of rumors." Jane lifted her head and looked at the principal in surprise. There was no fear or shame in her eyes, only confusion. "Patricia," she said calmly. "I don't know what Michael said to you, but his behavior was unprofessional. I am here as a nurse to help the students when needed, and I don't have time for any romantic affairs." "Oh, is that so?" Patricia nodded, satisfied. "I told him our Jane doesn't have time for that sort of thing. But he still managed to get your phone number. He knows how to be persuasive, I'll give him that. If you do have something with him, remember, we need to renovate the gym and the cafeteria, maybe he can help with money or building materials." "Oh, if I were 20 years younger, I'd bend him like a pretzel." Jane felt uneasy about the principal's confession. Giving her phone number to a stranger was not a good idea, and who exactly was this Michael? Could he be a business associate of Victor's? No, that didn't seem plausible. Her husband had always kept her far away from his business dealings. In the meantime, Patricia had left, leaving Jane deep in thought. The call from the classroom became her lifeline, as if she had been waiting for a signal to leave her desk. Truthfully, she couldn't wait to see Paul again, her only treasure. She also feared that Paul might misunderstand, feel hurt, or sad. The classroom was filled with the familiar sounds of children. Students who had just finished their lessons were talking, laughing, and sharing their thoughts. Paul sat at the front desk, his head buried in his notebook, but as soon as he saw his mother, his eyes lit up with joy. Jane gently walked over to her son, touching his hand and whispering, "Paul, sweetie, Mommy is here to see you." The boy smiled. "How are you, my love?" Jane asked, trying to hold back her tears. "I'm fine, we just had a test," Paul replied, his eyes avoiding hers. Jane's heart shattered into a million pieces. She knew her son was deliberately hiding the truth. He was very sad, and she realized it immediately. "Paul, your dad and I just had a court case," Jane began, trying to keep her voice steady, but her eyes were already brimming with tears. "I know," Paul whispered sadly. "You're going to live with your dad now," Jane continued. Paul slowly raised his eyes to look at his mother, and in them, she could see the pain that she never wanted to see. "I don't want to live with Dad." "I understand, sweetie," Jane whispered. "But that's the court's decision. I can't change anything." "So, you're not going to live with me?" Paul asked hopefully. Jane didn't know how to answer. Of course, she wanted to tell him that she would always be by his side, but she knew that would be a lie. "No, I will be living separately," Jane said, feeling a lump in her throat. "But I will visit you. We'll talk on the phone, and you can always count on me." "How many times will you visit me?" Paul asked, his voice filled with a hope that Jane did not want to crush. "As often as I can. Everything will be all right, Paul. I love you so much." "Will you miss me?" her son asked with a guileless, unguarded tone. His eyes glistened with tears. "I will miss you every second," Jane replied. They hugged each other for a while, and then Jane left, carrying an unbearable pain. When she returned to her office, she picked up the old phone she had left on the desk. The screen showed a missed call from an unknown number. Who could that be, she wondered. Just then, the phone rang again. Jane swiped the screen to answer. "Hello, Jane." A pleasant male voice came through the phone. "This is Michael. I hope I'm not bothering you." The name didn't ring any bells for Jane. "Yes, I'm listening," she replied. "You might not know who I am," the man continued. "But I am very grateful to you. You saved my brother's life." "Your brother?" Jane thought. "Which brother?" She remained silent, waiting for an explanation. "His name is Daniel," Michael continued. "He was disguised as a homeless person as part of an acting assignment for his audition at a drama school. But because of the heat, he had a heart attack. He's had heart issues since he was young and needed a pacemaker, but he refused. Anyway, you saved him." At that moment, Jane remembered everything. "Yes, it was just a few hours earlier near the bus stop." "Yes, that was me. Thank you for calling." "How is he?" Jane replied. "Daniel is fine now, he's back home." "Thank you so much, you have no idea what you've done," Michael's voice was filled with sincere gratitude. Jane hesitated, unsure of what to say. Meanwhile, Michael continued. "I'd really like to meet you to thank you in person, and if you don't mind, I'd like to know a little more about you." "I don't think meeting right now would be appropriate," Jane said, feeling her cheeks flush. "Oh, please, Jane," Michael paused, his tone becoming more insistent. "I don't just want to thank you, I also want you to know that I really don't know how to put this." Jane cut him off. "I'm a nurse. My job is to help others, and I didn't do anything special." "No, you did a lot for me," Michael replied. "You saved my brother's life." "All right," Jane said awkwardly. "We can meet, but not today." "How about tomorrow?" Michael asked hopefully. "Yes, tomorrow after work." "Where would you like to meet?" "I'll wait for you at the school gate," Michael said, his voice full of optimism as if he knew Jane would agree. "Okay, see you tomorrow," Jane replied, her voice trembling. Thank you, Jane, Michael said before she hung up. Jane sat down, closing her eyes as she tried to remember the face of the man she had helped on the street, the brother of a successful businessman but dressed like a homeless person for an acting assignment. What a strange situation. Why hadn't Daniel taken better care of his health? With a weak heart, he decided to test his acting skills under the scorching sun. Could he have picked a worse time? The rest of her shift passed without much notice. Finally, the workday was over, and Jane could head home. Paul had been picked up from school by Victor, who was accompanied by Sylvia, laughing and arm in arm as they walked down the hallway. Fortunately, Jane had enough strength to keep her composure and not confront them then and there. Jane stepped out of the school, taking a deep breath of fresh air. She was used to the noise and bustle of the schoolyard, but in the evening when everyone had gone home, she longed for the quiet. At the entrance to the school, Daniel, the janitor, greeted her. He looked worried and kept glancing around. Jane, Daniel said, grabbing her hand. We have a problem. There's a puppy stuck in a drain, and its leg is broken. Poor thing. Jane froze, not knowing what to say. I rescued it, Daniel said, showing her the tiny, fluffy puppy cradled in his arms. Poor little thing, Jane whispered, gently taking the puppy from the janitor's arms. How did you get stuck down there, huh? The puppy whimpered in pain and snuggled into her neck as if seeking comfort. Hang in there, little one, I'll take care of you, Jane said, stroking the puppy's head gently. No more crying, okay? Daniel looked at Jane with concern. What should we do? First, we need to treat its leg, and then we'll figure out what to do next. Where should we keep it for now? Daniel asked, puzzled. I think I can take it home, Jane said. You like animals, don't you? I don't know, Daniel hesitated. I already have a cat and a dog. Maybe you could keep it, at least until we find a new home for it. Jane thought for a moment and then waved, holding the puppy closer to her chest. All right, I'll take it in. It definitely shouldn't be left outside. When she got home, she carefully treated the puppy's leg. She applied a special ointment and bandaged the wound with a clean dressing. There you go, little one, you'll feel better now, she said softly, petting the puppy. Buddy, that's what I'll call you, okay? The puppy licked her hand gratefully, and Jane felt her heart fill with affection for the small, fragile creature. Buddy, she repeated, and the puppy responded with a happy bark. Throughout the evening, she took care of her new pet. She fed it a bowl of tasty meat broth with rice, which she had originally prepared for her cat, Cindy. At first, Cindy was not pleased with the new addition at the stairs, but later, she accepted Buddy and even allowed him to lick her fluffy cheek. When bedtime came, Jane felt an indescribable connection to this little creature. For a moment, it felt like Buddy had already become a part of her life, bringing warmth and joy to her rented apartment. She drifted off to sleep with the puppy in her arms, dreaming pleasant dreams. She imagined a bright meadow filled with colorful flowers. The puppy ran freely everywhere, and little Jane chased after it, laughing as her laughter echoed through the forest like the sound of ringing bells. The next morning, Jane woke up, her heart filled with tenderness. She happily petted Buddy, who was already awake and eagerly awaiting her attention. Good morning, she said, and Buddy joyfully licked the hand of his new owner. Heading into the kitchen, she prepared a simple breakfast for the puppy with warm milk and some bread pieces, while she enjoyed coffee and a sandwich. Memories of her distant childhood on her father's farm suddenly surfaced from somewhere deep in her subconscious. Jane had been just a little girl back then, and her life was closely tied to the world of animals. She remembered helping her father take care of a calf, feeding chickens, and playing with kittens. At that time, she felt happy being surrounded by love and care. But then her parents divorced, and Jane and her mother moved to the city, where she had to leave her beloved animals behind and start studying to become a nurse. Thinking of her childhood, Jane sighed sadly. All those years living in the city, she had always yearned for the peace and beauty of country life. But now, having found this little puppy, she felt like her dream of living in harmony with nature might finally come true. I wish my son was here too, she thought. And I wouldn't need anything more. Stay here, buddy, I have to go to work, Jane said with a smile, beginning to get ready. The puppy watched anxiously as she prepared to leave, hoping she would stay. Closing the door, Jane adjusted her bag on her shoulder and hurried to the bus stop. Taking the bus would be faster. Working as a school nurse wasn't easy. Children frequently got hurt, and Jane always had to be ready for anything. Despite the challenges, she loved her job. Sitting in her usual seat by the window on the bus, Jane thought about the past and her encounter with Victor, the man she had divorced just the day before in court. The bus gently rattled, almost making Jane drop her bag as she got lost in her thoughts. She caught it just in time, hugging it to her chest as if to comfort herself. Outside the window, gray buildings and stores passed by, appearing to be mere backdrops for the theater of her memories. The painful, heartbreaking day before was now starting to fade, making way for distant but bright memories. At that moment, the bus stopped at the school gate as usual, and Jane thanked the driver before stepping off. The kind man, wearing a cap and around 60 years old, smiled back and unconsciously stroked his cheerful mustache, as if recalling his youth. Walking through the school doors, Jane remembered she had an appointment with Michael after work, the brother of the man she had saved from a heart attack the day before. The principal glanced at her with a disapproving look and gave a curt nod, silently blaming her for all the trouble she had encountered in her important role. Sadly, Jane didn't know what her shift had in store for her. A fourth-grade girl, Yolanda Walter, came to school with a high fever, and Jane had to call an ambulance. Yolanda's mother was at work, and the girl had to face her illness alone. Jane did everything she could to help the student and her mother. She called a doctor to the school, then comforted Yolanda and called her mother at work. "Don't worry," she said. "Everything will be fine, it's probably just a seasonal virus." "Thank you so much, Jane." "I'm really grateful," the girl's mother said. "It's nothing," Jane replied. "You go ahead and focus on your work. I'll take care of your daughter." Jane stayed with Yolanda for about an hour until the doctor arrived. She read stories, played games, and comforted the girl as best as she could. "Don't be scared, it will pass," she told Yolanda. The girl cried softly, but eventually, the tears dried up. When the doctor arrived, she was asleep in the nurse's arms, and Jane smiled. She loved children and was happy to see them feel safe around her. The rest of her shift passed busily. Jane checked the medicine cabinets before leaving and tidied up the nurse's office. She was one of the last to leave the school, and she immediately heard the door slam behind her. She turned around and saw him, tall with dark hair and warm brown eyes. He stood a few steps away, leaning against the door of the black SUV. The businessman smiled, and Jane felt her heart race. "Jane," he called. "Let me introduce myself again. I'm Michael." "Hello," Jane replied, unsure of what to do with her hands. "You look wonderful," the businessman said with a smile. Jane blushed, she wasn't used to receiving such attention. It made her feel uncomfortable when a young man admired her so openly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm so glad you agreed to meet," Michael said. "And I'd like to invite you to dinner." "Dinner?" Jane asked, surprised. "But we just met." "I think we have a lot to talk about," Michael replied. "You could tell me about yourself, for example." Jane hesitated. On the one hand, she didn't want to turn down an invitation from such an attractive man. On the other, she wasn't sure she was ready for such a meeting. "I don't know," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've never gone to dinner with a man I just met." "Come on," Michael laughed. "Don't be afraid. It'll be fine. No expectations, just an evening together, that's all." All right, but it has to be somewhere simple, Jane said. I know a nice little cafe right in the city center, Michael eagerly suggested. Okay, but nothing too fancy. What are you talking about? Michael laughed. For you, I'm willing to turn the world upside down. All right, you've convinced me, Jane smiled. Then, they went to the cafe together. As she got into his car, Jane saw a luxurious interior for the first time. She couldn't take her eyes off the leather seats and the sleek dashboard. At that moment, she felt awkward and uncomfortable with the contrast between her simple life and Michael's extravagance. Where is Daniel? Jane asked, trying to distract herself from thoughts about the car. Daniel is at home, Michael replied. He hasn't fully recovered and is resting. He's had heart issues since childhood. I've always tried to convince him to get a pacemaker, but he still isn't ready. Jane nodded sympathetically. They continued driving through the city, with Michael acting like a professional tour guide, pointing out the most beautiful places. Jane was amazed by the beauty of the city she realized she had never really explored. It's wonderful, she exclaimed. I'm so glad you like it, Michael replied with a smile. She felt free and comfortable around him, forgetting her worries and simply enjoying the scenery. After a thorough tour, they arrived at a small but cozy and charming cafe. Jane was deeply impressed by the interior and the delicious food. Michael, thank you for a wonderful evening, she said, her tone becoming friendlier as she stood up from the table. I had a great time. I'm glad we got to spend this time together, he replied courteously, taking her hand. I'm sorry, but I think I've stayed too long, Jane said, a bit shyly. Of course, he smiled. I understand. Michael drove her home but wasn't quick to say goodbye. He looked at her with tender eyes, as if he didn't want to part. I'm sorry, but I can't do this, Jane whispered. I understand, Michael said. But I'd like to see you again. We'll see, she replied. I'm not sure I'm ready for a new relationship. Just give me a chance, he pleaded. I don't want to push you, but I really want to be with you. Jane thought for a moment. She felt herself growing fond of Michael, but she was also determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. All right, give me a few days to think about it. I'll wait, Michael said as they parted, disappearing into the night. Jane entered her apartment and fed her dog, Coco, who had missed her terribly. Then, she went to her room and opened her diary, starting to write down everything that had happened that day. She had kept this diary since 5th grade, filling up dozens of notebooks. Dear Diary, she wrote. Today I might have met the man of my dreams, but I'm scared to let him into my life, afraid of getting hurt again. But still, I want to be happy. What should I do? Who will give me the right advice? Of course, the ink-stained pages answered her with silence. Jane closed the diary, put it in the drawer, and went to bed. However, she couldn't stop thinking about Michael. After weighing the pros and cons, she decided to give him a chance and see how things would turn out. In the days that followed, they met quite often, taking walks in the park, watching movies, and having coffee at various cafes. Jane enjoyed Michael's company. He was always caring and attentive, making her feel comfortable and free around him. At the same time, she never forgot about her son, whom she saw daily at school during breaks and after classes. Jane also honestly told Michael about her past and asked for his help in revisiting the divorce case. Michael listened quietly, and when he heard about Victor's wrongdoings in business, he was sympathetic. Jane only saw Daniel once, briefly, through the tinted window of the car. According to Michael, his brother was preparing for pacemaker surgery and was very anxious about it. Jane felt like she was on cloud 9. She thought she had finally found her man, strong, caring, loving, and someone who could protect her from all her troubles. One day, as she was walking past a large business center, Jane noticed a familiar car. She stopped and looked through the tinted window, seeing a familiar face. Michael, who had recently been so chivalrous and polite, sat there with an unhappy look on his face, staring at her as if she didn't exist. She couldn't understand why he was avoiding her, not waving hello after all the affection and care he had shown. Jane recalled all their meetings, the dates, and the kisses, and she started feeling uneasy. Had she been mistaken all this time? Jane was shocked, unable to believe what she had just seen. She was sure Michael was her destined partner, but now she didn't know what to think. Gathering her courage, she decided to talk to Michael and find out the truth. "Michael," she asked. "Please tell me, where has Daniel been hiding all this time?" Michael was taken aback by her question. "What do you mean?" "I saw you today," Jane said. "You were sitting in the car with the tinted windows, but I recognized you." "Jane," Michael said, his voice tinged with anxiety. "You've misunderstood everything. I'm sorry, I should have told you sooner. The truth is, Michael is my twin brother. We look very much alike, and many people get us confused." "But you said you were Michael, and Daniel was at the hospital preparing for surgery?" Jane asked, her voice almost breaking from the shock. "That's right," the man answered, his tone heavy with sadness. "I just wanted to get to know you, but I couldn't do it the normal way. So it was Michael at first, but after that, it was me." Jane was stunned. "So all this time, the person I was seeing wasn't Michael, but you?" "I'm sorry," Daniel said. "I know I was wrong, but I love you and didn't want you to push me away." "You love me?" "But I thought I was dating Michael," she replied. "Yes, Jane, but it's me who truly loves you and wants to be with you." "Then how can I trust you now?" she asked. "You lied to me." "I know, but I'm willing to make it right, and I promise to be honest with you from now on." Jane was confused, not sure what to do next. Deep down, she loved this man, but she couldn't forgive such a deception easily. "I know this is a difficult decision," Daniel said, taking her hand. "But I will wait for your answer." "All right, I'll think about it," she replied, looking at Daniel and trying to sort out her feelings. "I love you," he said, then kissed her cheek. "I'll be waiting for your call." 2 weeks passed. Jane decided to trust Daniel, and she met with Michael, who apologized on behalf of his brother for the forced deception. After much deliberation and hesitation, Daniel finally agreed to undergo surgery to implant a pacemaker. The decision was not easy, but Jane convinced him that it was the best thing for a long and happy life. "I love you," Daniel whispered, holding her hand tightly. "But I'm really scared that this surgery could be the end for me." "Don't be afraid," Jane said, resting her cheek against his. "Everything will be okay, you're strong, and you will get through this, and I'll be with you every step of the way." Daniel smiled, and hope glimmered in his eyes. At that moment, Jane felt happier than she ever had. She was sure they were meant to be together, facing every challenge in life, one step at a time. Fortunately, thanks to advanced techniques and the professionalism of the doctors, the surgery was a success. Daniel was still weak but was feeling much better. Jane stayed by his bedside the entire time, caring for him, feeding him with a spoon, reading his favorite books, and singing gentle songs. Her love was so strong that Daniel felt like he was wrapped in a warm, gentle cocoon. "Jane," he whispered, looking at her with tear-filled eyes. "You are my angel. You saved my life." Jane smiled and stroked his hand, saying, "Don't say such silly things. We will get through everything that fate has in store for us. I'll be here until you fully recover." A month went by, and Daniel made remarkable progress. He could walk, though he still felt weak. "Jane, I want you to be my wife. I can't live without you. You are my everything, and life only has meaning with you in it." Tears of happiness welled up in Jane's eyes. "I would love that." They got married on a warm, sunny morning. The ceremony was simple but incredibly touching. The wedding was filled with the fragrance of fresh flowers, the gentle sounds of a violin, and the chirping of birds. It seemed as if nature itself was celebrating the couple. The sun shone brightly, like the happiness in Jane and Daniel's eyes. The bride and groom looked beautiful together, young and full of hope for the bright future they were going to build together. After the ceremony and a photo session under a colorful floral arch, the guests gathered at tables adorned with crisp white tablecloths and elegant vases of white roses. The air was filled with laughter, joyful conversations, clinking glasses, and heartfelt congratulations for the newlyweds. Surrounded by their closest loved ones, Jane and Daniel pledged their eternal love and fidelity, binding their lives together forever. The most special gift for the couple was Paul's return. Michael had successfully arranged for the case to be retried in court. The judge listened to the child's wishes and made a ruling in favor of his mother. "I missed you so much, Mom," Paul shouted, hugging her tightly. Jane embraced her son, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "I missed you too, my sweet boy," Jane said, glowing with happiness as she looked at Paul's smiling face. "Now, you will stay with us forever." "Yes, Mom, I've been waiting for this for so long," Paul replied. Daniel watched them with a gentle smile, feeling warmth and joy in his heart. He was ready to do anything to keep his family happy. When Victor found out that his son had returned to his mother, he was furious. He tried to argue until he discovered that Sylvia, his lover, had been cheating on him the entire time and was pregnant by someone else, someone more influential. "You betrayed me," he roared, feeling both betrayed and humiliated. He had trusted in Sylvia's affection, only to realize she had been toying with him. "Leave," Victor said coldly, not even looking back at her. "I will never forgive you." Sylvia lowered her head and quietly left his house. Before her lay a new life, free from legal battles and disputes with the ex-wives of her lovers. That evening, after a tiring day of wedding festivities, Jane and Daniel lay in bed, gazing at the moonlight illuminating the peaceful scenery of the estate through the window. The room was silent, broken only by their gentle breathing. Jane and Daniel nestled close to each other, basking in the warmth of their love. Meanwhile, downstairs, Paul and the little puppy were
If you
playfully
enjoyed this
romping
story,
around,
we
brimming
invite
with
you to give it a
happiness.
like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.